are so excited to launch our first open community call at Interchange, which we are focusing on gaining more insight and awareness of open source and InnerSource program offices. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. We will be doing questions at around past. So if you'd like to ask your question directly, feel free to either post it in the Insights chat feed in the community group or directly into the chat within Zoom. And be happy to ask those questions. If you would like to come on live and ask questions, you're welcome to raise your hand when we get to that portion. Be happy to come on and have you engage with everybody. So this is going to be a very organic kind of fireside chat style because Grania and I, who is the co-founder here at Interchange as well, we don't really like conversations that are, you know, in the box. We like to be out of the box and just see where things take us, because that's how you uncover and discover insights and things that we wouldn't normally think of until we get outside of those boxes. So that's how we will go today. We are joined today by 3 experts on the topic for both InnerSource and open source program offices. Their bios are in the community feed, so you can learn more about the extensive work and experience that they have. But pleased to introduce to you Clare Dillon, Executive Director at InnerSource Commons, Sayeed Choudhury, Director at OSPOs for Johns Hopkins University, and Daniel Izquierdo, CEO at Bitergia, and I know is involved in many open communities as well, so has everybody has a breadth of experience on the topic today that we'll be talking about. So to get started, just ask each of you a little bit about how you first got involved with open source program offices, or what drew you to the idea of creating an InnerSource or open source program office. And Claire, I'm going to kick off to you first, and then we'll see what Daniel and Sayeed have to say.
Sure, thank you. Well, I actually came to open source program offices probably through the InnerSource journey. So for those of you who are not familiar with InnerSource, it's the using methods and practices from the open source, but to create proprietary code within organizations. So I've been working with InnerSource Commons, which is the community that helps share knowledge about InnerSource since back in 2018. And through that, I actually met a number of the folks that had been involved in setting up the OSPO++ network, which is a network for OSPOs or open source program offices in universities and governments and civic organizations. And Sayeed is one of those organizers. And we've come together to actually look at how we can actually encourage the institutionalization of open source in civic institutions. And of course, InnerSource is often a step on the path to open source. So we often find that many folks that are looking at open source program offices are often considering InnerSource as part of their journey, and into people creating InnerSource program offices, sometimes inside OSPOs, sometimes independently, but there's a lot of crossover as well. So that's my background with respect to that.
Then in my specific case, when this all was related to when I started doing research on open source. So I hold a PhD in empirical software engineering. And back in 2006, here in Spain, where I'm from, there were certain, specifically universities and regions from the public administrations that they were starting to use the concept of open source and having their own even Linux distributions and so on. This definition of OSPO from back in those years in Spain and what we can define as an OSPO nowadays is a bit different, but that's probably the first time I heard about the concept of OSPO. And then, of course, during the last maybe 4 or 5 years, when all of these terms started to, be around us and so on, and initially specifically focused on companies, this concept, well, the concept I first heard from was typically from companies in the US and so on.
And I became involved in OSPOs through a conversation with one of the other organizers of OSPO++, Jacob Green. Both of us are actually graduates of Johns Hopkins, and we're interested in for various reasons in terms of how universities can get better organized around open source software, but with the aim, I mean, there are a lot of sort of institution-specific reasons and value to that approach, but the main overarching driver was, in order for universities to better engage with other universities, municipalities, communities, to solve very important problems at scale. We had those conversations before COVID, but they've become even more pronounced, of course, post-COVID. So we launched the OSPO at Johns Hopkins, building on some of the corporate OSPOs that Daniel just referred to, but we have in many ways expanded that and adapted it for the university context. And I think we have some very interesting early successes to share in terms of how this is changing the way universities might be able to engage.
Forgot that I muted myself, excuse me. You had mentioned COVID and the pandemic. And so something that we always talk about is we can never go back to the world that was pre-pandemic. Not that anybody may necessarily want to, but it's gone. And so we're completely looking at how to look at rapid innovation differently and looking at resiliency and focusing on more sustainable solutions. How do we see these types of program offices helping organizations or civic groups that you mentioned, governments and businesses? How do we think about this differently to fuel a more sustainable and resilient growth?
Yeah, I can start. This is the problem with Twitter. I saw this on a tweet, so I can't give you attribution. But basically, it was a picture that somebody took of something that had been spray painted, which is, we can't go back to normal because normal is what got us here in the first place. So I think that really sums it up very well. I think there's more than an appetite at this point to not go back to the way things were and to not assume that the way we did things in the past is a good path forward, given the very major structural shifts and changes and transformation we're going through. And that is true of universities, right? So universities typically work with each other through things like grants or legal agreements, MOUs and data use agreements and so on. And I'm not saying that's no longer valid. There's a place for that, but it's clearly not sufficient. And I'm not the only one that believes this. I'm involved in a lot of efforts at the national scale in the US, most recently through the National Academy of Sciences, and went to a session of university presidents and provosts who were saying things like, we have to get away from the hero culture, the idea that there's this one superstar that's going to solve all these problems, or put too much faith into this one individual as being the one showing us the way. And very strong recognition that the solutions to these problems lie in the communities that are being affected by these problems, right? And open source, we talk about this as a verb, is a fundamentally important way to engage with these communities directly. So universities don't show up and say, we have all the answers, now we're here to convey them to you. But rather, we're in this together with you. What are you hearing? What are you facing? What are your ideas? How do we take those, incorporate them into the university, and amplify the work that we're doing?
And I'd like to build on that, because I think, you know, when COVID hit, not only did the universities react, but we had lots of grassroots movements and communities coming together to try and address some of the issues that then, you know, arose from the pandemic. And there were a lot of folks that did amazing work in terms of actually collaborating on open source code and open source hardware. There was a great example that many folk in Ireland were involved in with the ventilator project, the open source ventilator project. I mean, that was thousands of people. Now, you look at the effort there, the network that they created, the collaboration effort. And, you know, in some respects, it hasn't necessarily lived into the same vibrancy as it was. But the point was, they had to solve a lot of problems in terms of how to organize themselves, right? They were doing it from the grassroots, first principles model. And they were looking about how to connect with, for example, our health service executive. They were looking how to connect with other people across Europe. They were trying to get facilitators and collaborators into the project. And they all had to do that from scratch in the time, just in time, as the issue emerged. And I think what we've learned when we've been thinking about the idea of an OSPO is that it can actually help with the idea of putting structure on this sort of collaboration, first of all, so that when people are looking about how to collaborate, those kind of frameworks and the ways of working has already been set up, and the constraints have already been identified, and some of the friction might have been taken out of the system. But more importantly than that, it's like a beacon so that people know who to contact if they're looking for collaborators, right? So like Sayeed now, in the context of Johns Hopkins University, if anyone's doing anything in open source, you know, you can go to the OSPO there and you can figure out who's who, and you have a pathway to collaborate. And the more OSPOs then that are created, the better we are able to create these really effective networks of collaboration, so that people aren't just doing it in an ad hoc just-in-time basis when the need arises, but that we're building really sustainable networks of collaboration that can help us not only, you know, solve today's problems, but can be activated really quickly for tomorrow's problems when they arise.
Yeah, and indeed, I wanted to add on top of this that because of COVID, most of the world started to look at technology even as a more important asset. And the thing is that this technology, or a big chunk of this technology, is open source. So basically, we are here because open source exists somehow. We can keep collaborating, we can keep running, we can keep discussing, and we can keep working because there are out there open source projects that are, you know, facilitating all of this process, including other technologies or proprietary technologies. But all of this is part of the critical stack of large corporations, universities, and so on, governments, municipalities, etc. And because of this, the role of OSPO is becoming more and more important, because this is the place where we are centralizing all of this understanding and knowledge in the different entities and so on. It doesn't matter if this is a government or if this is a university or a large corporation. You need to understand how to effectively and safely consume open source, but then at the same time, how to contribute back this, again, safely and effectively to be, let's say, a good open source citizen. Because in that way, we are all, you know, collaborating. We are all creating these sustainable ecosystems, and we can define ecosystem in different ways, as a really small set of people or large corporations around, you know, the different technologies. So OSPOS is one of these key players probably nowadays.
One of the areas that that Jen and I are particularly interested in is behaviours and sort of behaviours that can promote or prevent collaboration. Have you experienced that where you're trying to move something forward and sort of people's behaviours or perhaps systemic processes are blocking that in some way?
Who wants to take that one?
there are a lot of them. If we go to one extreme, we can go even for the discussion about budgets. Because I know, let's imagine in a corporation or in a university, maybe this is my budget, so this is my responsibility. Out of this, I don't care. And because of this, that's, I mean, if well, this is maybe to corner case, but if we try to extract the concept of money from the discussions, that suddenly what is the best next approach? Basically collaborate and build something together, you know, create somehow a community. So sometimes when we are, you know, in Bitergia, one of the things we do is we help corporations to build their own OSPO or ISPO. And for this, one of the first discussions we have with them is, okay, let's ignore for a moment the money thing. And then let's discuss about how can we move effectively into, you know, growing all together across different geographical regions and so on to create something, right? And once you remove that specific asset from the discussion, then things are much simpler. Of course, this problem is there and you have to deal with budgets and money and so on. So you can bring this afterwards to the discussion. But this is really useful to say, okay, we ignore this in the first bunch, we define how we are collaborating, and then we bring the problem again. But now we have all, you know, agreed how we are proceeding as next steps. So the problem of the money is something that we can discuss afterwards. But if you remove this from the conversation, is quite useful. So that's one of the things, probably. Claire?
Yeah, sorry, Sayeed, were you going to hop in there?
I at the risk of this becoming very administrative in nature, but I am an administrator. In addition to budgets, there's risk. So one of the real epiphanies I had working in Hopkins for many years is we spend a great deal of time worrying about risk. And one of the ways to address that risk is that there's a shared sense of risk. It's that, you know, no single university is going out on their own. Other, you know, basic research, wonderful. We want to take risks, we want to be innovative. Legal agreements, not so much. So we have a very real case where working with a local community center in West Baltimore called the St. Francis Neighborhood Center and the city of Paris around an open source municipal platform called the Test. In another world, we would have tried to write a memorandum of understanding or some sort of use agreement between a community center in West Baltimore, a university in the US, and the city of Paris. I don't think I need to tell any of you how complicated that would be. So we basically took an approach of there's an open source license for this platform. This is a canonical license supported, you know, if you will, endorsed by the Open Source Initiative. it lays out very clearly the IP issues, the risk issues, and so on. And the conversation changed from, we want to avoid risk, to, well, there it is. You can take a look at it. And by the way, many people use this license and collaborate effectively. So if you have concerns around those, we have lots of other examples we can look to. Made the conversation very, very different. So if you can park budget and risk, certainly in a university setting, you'll have a lot more fruitful conversations than if you try to codify that in the legal agreement.
And I would add to that, because I think the points you've made about, like, if we strip out things like budget, I mean, I've always been, I think it's extraordinary how, isn't it Conway's law, which says that, like, technology is built to reflect the organizations it's in. I mean, like, if we let that happen in terms of responding to the stuff that's out there right now, we will not succeed. So we can't let that happen. So I love the idea of stripping it away. Open source in many respects allows you to do that, as Sayeed described. But I think as well that the OSPO construct in itself then allows you to streamline that even further potentially, right? So both in terms of, you know, if you start with the assumption there that we stripped everything all the way, so we're building the right thing in the right way to start with, but then these issues do crop up, right? The issues of you know, budgets, who's paying for this, or the issue of risk above and beyond what might be, you know, even in terms of an open source license, like, for example, what is my software bill of materials, or what you know, which open source license can I use, or anything like that, right? There are these kind of system level risks that people then have to grapple with. And if an OSPO is in place, they can help deal with that in a very, very, again, efficient way. They may have expertise in those areas. And then they also sometimes can even mediate between organizations to give them patterns for how they may even be able to approach those kind of budgetary negotiations and things like that. And we're certainly seeing folks in OSPOs and even ISPOs in particular, actually, for the InnerSource, even within organizations, people stepping up to be able to help those sort of conversations happen purely by just showing ways forward. Like, you know, okay, other organizations do it this way. This is how they actually agree to not only build this and fund it to begin with, but also maintain it and sustain it in the future. And these are really important conversations for us to be able to gather the learnings from, because if everyone's working that out each time round, it's just a very inefficient way to move forward. But if we do have patterns that work, that involve corporations and universities and governments and community groups, and we can kind of say, this has been done before, and we're the organization that knows that and can guide you through that. That's where the OSPO can become incredibly powerful in accelerating these collaborations.
Yeah, and indeed, sorry, Jem, but
No.
I wanted to say that if now kind of being the evil's advocate, the thing here is that OSPOs and ISPOs are created because of budget and risk reasons. The thing is about how can OSPOs and ISPOs have this, you know, control in their outside, so they are not affecting the people being part of those teams within the companies or corporations. Because, you know, OSPOs are created because large corporations would like to become cool, because they would like to become more effective, because there is a talent war out there, because many reasons, and most of them are related to budget and risk analysis, definitely. So yeah.
But there's more than just that, right? Because I mean, you know, you always start there with the compliance and legal and risk, and OSPOs get a bad name from that perspective. It's kind of like they're out there with the legal, you know, basher thing, going not that license, only this license, and what about these terms? But that's, I mean, I think they're evolving very far beyond that now, and certainly even in terms of from a cultural perspective, because you were talking about the behaviors earlier. Like I've seen folks in both OSPOs and ISPOs like really turning to, how do we motivate people, how do we inspire people to collaborate, how do we incentivize great collaboration, how do we reward that in a formal way, in an informal way. So I think they're moving beyond that idea of just that kind of compliance risk idea to also be amplifiers of good behavior, showcasing that, communicating that, praising people, rewarding great efforts. All of these things now sometimes fall under that kind of OSPO umbrella as well. So it is more than just policing or systems process stuff. It's definitely they're definitely making a difference in terms of helping to show the way that we all want to collaborate better, right?
Yeah, this is one of the key differences between a corporate and university setting, right? As the head of the OSPO, I will never show up at a researcher's office and tell them, "Thou shalt use the following license." That will be a very brief and unpleasant conversation, at least for me. So it's a very different model in terms of we don't have a corporate strategy for these are the licenses we use, these are the engineering practices we have. We basically talk about best practices. This is what we can learn from other contexts. And very importantly, one thing I've talked about is universities are built on these three pillars: research, education, translation. The translation being, how do we take the research and education beyond the walls of the university? That translation, to reinforce Claire's point, that translation piece has been critical. In essence, what the OSPO is able to do in a university setting is says there are different ways to do translation. It isn't only technology transfer, it isn't only commercialization. It can be working with the community, it can be producing open code, it can be helping school kids work on an open source platform. So there are many researchers who want to go from that lab-like environment to this translation, but they don't know how. And balancing that while you're doing your early stages of research or you have a grant, we're not here to tell you what to do. But if you want to make that translation jump, it's in your best interest to look at how many other people have done this effectively and how the communities with whom you wish to work want to do this. Whereas in the past, you would go to a tech transfer office typically, and I'm not being critical of tech transfer, they have a certain role. That's not been the way they've worked. So the OSPO provides this alternate way of thinking about it.
So it really sounds like OSPOs can help empower culture change outside of the OSPO, right? So it's now beginning to affect both internal organization and relationships with whatever that community definition is for the organization. So that's fascinating because that's the work that we love doing, is thinking about how can we get people to understand culture change, and that culture isn't just how people feel when they come to work in an environment with their team, but that it is things like the ethos of the organization, but it's the processes, it's the workflow, it's how we communicate, and the behaviors behind that, as well as the values that we gather around to do the work, are all part of a culture. So I swear I don't want to keep coming back to this administration type of question, but Daniel said something with the money and it made me think, yes, that seems to be everyone's first barrier and challenge is, well, how are we going to budget? How is it going to be funded? But aren't we, in effect, by doing collaboration openly, by having an InnerSource or open source program office, aren't we empowering the money to then come? Meaning that we are creating operational savings somewhere, that we are not taking as long maybe to solve a problem, because if we're collaborating with many people, we're able to get there faster. Aren't we in essence then ultimately creating a cost savings by having these types of program offices?
Yes, I'll go now. So if we think again about the tech stack of any university or corporation, most of it is not part of their own business. It's just technology they need to use, let's say, as a commodity. It's something that operating systems or maybe big data technologies or something like this. And this is all out there. So just by the existence of this software and being able to use this effectively internally, you're basically saving money. You're saving money because of different reasons. Just because there are people, if this is open source, there are people out there that they probably know about the technology, so it's easy for you to hire that specific skills out there. If not, you can train them on those specific skills you are looking for. You are saving money because you are directly using the technology. You can do specific developments or modifications. You can study the source code, and this is because all of this is open source. You can redistribute the code to your customers, or maybe you are building some SaaS solution or anything similar. But the point is that together with this and the collaboration with other entities or corporations, basically this is a really effective way to develop software. So we cannot, so what about having a corporation or a university building their Linux kernel from scratch? Doesn't make sense. I mean, it's out there, right? So does it make any sense to do this? Probably no.
But I have to add in here, because I think this is at the crux of the behavior, a cultural issue, right? Because oftentimes it wouldn't make sense, right? But at the same time, there is still like that whole issue of the money and the budget. Like, I mean, if you think about organizations and budgetary allocations, like sometimes people want the budget, they want to pay for it, they want the bill because they want to justify a higher budget, which means they get a bigger team. It means they may have control that they may not have otherwise. And the need for that, the psychological need for that versus I'm now going to give it away to some sort of collaborative effort. Like that's hard for people, and it does have. I mean, to be fair, that's not an imaginary concern either. It could have, for example, a direct impact on how many people they can employ in their organization, and may mean that if they're doing something that is a collaborative effort where the budget goes or can be saved in some respect, it may mean that they have to lay people off for something like that. So, I do think that budgetary discussion is a very important one, and it's not often as simple as, oh sure, overall this will save money, because sometimes that's not the primary motivator. It is this idea of, or there may be some excessive control issues, there may be some, you know, backstage power struggles going on that are very linked to budgetary allocations. So I think, again, some of these things are system things and organizational artifacts that are in the system, but they can block these collaborations, because everyone in the collaboration is like, but this should make sense. We should just all do this. Of course it makes sense. Everything Daniel said is exactly true. And yet it doesn't happen. And why doesn't it happen? Because, well, I'd love to, but, and then there's all this list of reasons that you're wondering where they came from, but sometimes it's coming from this need for probably over indexing some of these things. And again, that's where an OSPO can step in perhaps and mediate through some of these things and help at that kind of organizational level to look at some of these constraints and work in the background, again, not just in time when the friction may occur, but work in the background to be able to advocate for more open collaborative models with leadership, for example, being able to help them work through how this can actually help, and how there may be quid pro quo, and you know, just because you're collaborating doesn't mean you slash the budget on A and give it all to B, because that can cause friction. But how do you do that in a more fair, you know, transitionary way? So these are, again, all these concerns are really, they're often organizational, as I said, artifacts, and therefore sometimes you need an organizational construct to be able to deal with them, because some little individual going, this doesn't make sense, you know, we should all just be working together. Like they may not get very far in with that friction that might be going on at an organizational level.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised with the assertion that budget and culture are intertwined. And I think that in any organization, certainly in a university, one doesn't show up and say to the senior leadership, hi, I'm here to change the culture of your organization. That's a non-starter. So one of the interesting things I've learned from the open source community is this idea of patterns, right? And I think what an OSPO does is expose an organization like a university to new and different patterns. And one of those patterns and culture change aspects is you can gain a lot by using open source. If your institution is constantly under the impression that we're giving something away, why would we do this? We're just giving things away. Sure, I mean, we're human beings. I can understand somebody saying, I don't constantly want to give away things and get nothing in return. But even in these early days, we have clear examples of how we are gaining by working in an open way and using open source licenses. And this has permeated the research administration, the legal, the tech transfer groups. There's an understanding of, oh, I get it. We're actually gaining something by doing this as well. We've been working with Steve and Wally at Microsoft since the beginning of this OSPO, and he taught a course. He's still teaching a course at Hopkins this semester, where he has a wonderful set of sessions where he talks about, this is not altruistic. These are practical engineering economic decisions to use open source. Microsoft isn't to some degree is being altruistic, of course, but the bottom line is Microsoft benefits by doing things this way. So if I can go to a Hopkins administrator and say, Microsoft benefits by using open source in this way, it's a lot harder to say, well, why, what possible reason could a company have or university have for doing this? So being able to make it very practical and pragmatic and budget oriented ultimately will change the culture. There are more people now starting to realize, oh, open source isn't this radical, give everything away and we get nothing back in return. It's very practical, it's very real. There are Fortune 500 companies using it and making business decisions around it. Surely we can learn from that.
Absolutely. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if we're about half past. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask them live, you can raise your hand. Just give you a minute to do that if you've been lost in thought like I have. I have so many questions. My experience through being part of or kind of nestled underneath an open source program office is the Open Organization, and acting as an ambassador there. And it's been a learning opportunity, to say the least, because as it grows and stretches and redefines itself, I'm always finding I have more questions, because we operate more as a knowledge-based community. We're not, putting technology together and writing code. We're thinking about the behaviors. We're thinking about how project teams come together and operate, and how we can shift organizational models based on these, these key tenets that we operate around. And so I'm always fascinated to think about what else can we learn about knowledge-based communities that are operating in this way, so that we can share more. Whenever we come together, I'm always sharpened by the people in my group when we have conversations. I always think about something from a new perspective, which grows me personally and professionally. And so that's something I would think as the benefit of an OSPO, is people coming together to think about those problem solving. Sorry. I started reading the question that we have here from Brian, is what are your favorite or preferred metrics for communicating on OSPO's successes across the organization? Or put another way, what types of data do you prefer to collect in order to tell internal stories about the OSPO's successes? Let you run with that.
I can start in the university setting. As strange as this might sound, some of these are very foundational, such as what open source software is Johns Hopkins producing? That is not an easy question to answer. We are still working our way through that. But that is an incredibly important foundational piece of data or information to know. And again, interestingly enough, we have the lessons learned around open data that we can rely on. So if I were to go to the institution and say, what open data does Johns Hopkins produce? We may have a better answer, but we didn't arrive there in a strategic way. And I'm not picking on Johns Hopkins. I think this is true of any university in the US. So we have an opportunity to reflect on that and basically say, let's be more organized around open source software from these foundational ways. Like, what's the inventory? What are the profiles of the licenses we use? What are the dependencies we have? We're working with Bitergia, for example, on some of these kinds of foundational questions. And we're finding that researchers honestly just hadn't even done much about this, not because they don't care, but because they simply didn't know how. So we're getting researchers who finally show up and say, wait, you can tell me who's making contributions. You can help me figure out, the sort of cycle of the commits that are happening. So a lot of the metrics that the chaos group have been working with are really important in this kind of foundational way. Looking externally, though, what I would say is, the university is looking for new ways of working with other organizations and engaging communities more directly. Again, we tend to do these things through the way universities receive money. We have calls for proposals, we give funding to community centers and communities throughout the city, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's very useful in its own way. But working with a community center without a grant and the city of Paris on a new system is just completely novel. It's just something that hasn't happened before in a university context. So that is a very important, marker of success. that we're able to work in a different way, we're able to solve a local problem. I'm viewing this as building a laboratory of sorts, right? One of the interesting things we're finding in the university is many researchers are more interested in collaborating around the open source code than writing data use agreements, because they're complicated and they're difficult and they're specific. And then as soon as you sign them and you see each other's data, you go, oh my God, we didn't account for 50% of the use cases we actually need. And God forbid a third institution get involved, because getting 3 institutions to sign an agreement will be nonlinear. So we're getting these researchers basically saying, isn't an open source platform a lab of sorts, right? And can I not learn more about the data by looking at the code and what people are doing, what algorithms are running, and so on? So these ideas around how people collaborate within the university, outside the university, how many more people are starting to contribute, to say nothing of the students, of course, who have an incredible appetite for learning about this, want to do this for their own, education, their research, their job prospects. So there are a lot of kinds of things we're tracking in terms of how is the OSPO changing the way the university works, the outputs of the university, and the impact of the university.
Claire, you want to go ahead?
Well, now you're more of the expert on the metrics and measurement, but I'll just say that in the context of InnerSource program offices, at any rate, and I know that, and I'm sure Daniel will go into this, perhaps just what people measure may often depend on what their priorities are in terms of why they may have approached some of these things. But I'll just mention one conversation that has come up a couple of times recently when I've been talking to a number of both OSPOs doing InnerSource or InnerSource program offices as well, and that is this idea of measuring the collaborations itself, like so an instance of collaboration, which I think Sayeed mentioned in the context of, for example, in the joint grant thing or something like that. Very, very, very useful as well in a corporate context where you're demonstrating collaboration between various different business units, for example, or demonstrating that reuse of code. So in the discussion of why an organization may need to change their culture or reinvent themselves, you want to be able to point to these shining lights of collaboration actually happening. Organizations want to see that. They want to understand there's an instance here, there's an instance there, or look at these great people. So in order to reward that, and in order to understand how much of that is happening from an internal collaboration perspective at any rate, but then also I'm assuming from an external cross-organizational perspective in an open source world, just measuring those instances of contributions across borders, whatever that border is, whether it's your business unit, whether it's your company, whether it's your organization, whether it's a national, collaboration, those instances of collaboration, it's just so important to measure those so we can reward them and look at them and examine what could have been done better from a system perspective in the future.
Yeah, and I agree definitely with both of you about having collaboration as one of the main key aspects to measure success of maybe the OSPO or the InnerSource program office. Yeah, so the question I typically, when I have this question on the table, I try to ask this again back in somehow as saying, what are your business goals, right? Or cultural goals maybe that you are trying to achieve. Because of this, maybe you are running an OSPO because you are looking for new people to join the company or the university, or so maybe you are looking for being more effective in the development of software, maybe because you like to bring other and different point of view to the discussion that we are all having. So that depends, and those goals are somehow defining the metrics that you need to have in mind. Because it's not the same to discuss about the reusability of the source code than being faster to market, maybe, than fostering collaboration across different university departments and so on. And then once we have this in mind about the goals, then this depends on the role you have or the role you are playing. So it's not the same if you are in marketing, if you are an engineer, if you are in human resources, in people, if you are discussing about legal or taxes. So those metrics are different depending on the people that we are talking to. So probably the thing is, if we have the question on the table, what is the most important metric for you for an OSPO? Probably we have, I know we are in this call many people, so we will have probably as many metrics as people we are right now, and that's the thing. So thinking about metrics, I would try to use the other way around. Let's think together about the goals of having an OSPO, and then once we have the goals, then we can start, splitting this, divide and conquer, and go into the metrics. So we typically have this discussion with customers about the goal question metric approach. So then you have the business goals, then you are trying to divide this into specific questions, and then you go at the very end into the metrics. Going to the metrics themselves, we've been discussing about two main areas. We've discussed about maybe high level metrics, something that perhaps you can let's say gather automatically and somehow, because you are looking at the systems, how people are collaborating, maybe in the wikis or producing code or so. There is another one that I would say is really, really important, which is the more people aspect, and it's directly talk to them, talk to the developers, the people, the researchers, all of these different roles, and ask them if this way of working, this new way, this new cultural approach to the same problems, let's say, we've had in the past, if this is something that is being rewarding to them, if they are learning, if they feel more engaged, and so on. So there is, I don't remember, I think it was IDC, they said that 70% of the employees of large corporations are disengaged. That's a huge percentage. And open source is here probably to change things. And if we move into more transparent and collaborative ways within corporations, I think this engagement will increase as we can see all of this engagement in open source communities. So that's the challenge probably about OSPOs. So I would say engagement might be one of those metrics that we may consider.
Yeah, if I can maybe give an example that relates to what Daniel just said. So one of the groups we've been working with at Hopkins is part of a large multi-university consortium around health informatics, health data informatics. And they have taken exactly this approach of we're going to work with open source software and write tools that are open and collaborate through those tools and that software, and then get the insights into the data. And I spoke with the leader from Hopkins and the leader of the entire effort based at Columbia, but this is many institutions working together, and they are at an inflection point. So the success is this has worked. They have built a lot of interest around this. There's a lot of universities that want to do this. The problem they now face, the good problem they face, was summed up very clearly by the director of Columbia. He said, I do not want to become an expert in open source software. I don't want to be a community manager. I don't want to learn what it means to have to coordinate this many institutions. I need help. And one of the key questions and concerns they're looking at is a sustainability one, right? So there are a few heroes, whatever you used to call them, we talked about this, who are making massive numbers of contributions, right? And they know who they are. It's not hard to figure out who these people are. And everybody's going to them, right, for help and so on and so on. What's their concern? Burnout. They might leave. They might get tired of this. There's lots of reasons why those folks might say, I can't keep doing this anymore, right? I need other people to get involved. Where does something like this kind of analysis that they're just talking about is helpful? Who's making commits? How often are they making those commits? Where are they located? Are there clusters of institutions that are doing this work around particular tools? So you can imagine them now saying, hey, we have a strategy, right? We have a real vulnerability in this set of tools here because there's one person doing all the work. And we have another group of people over here who have coalesced, more or less. They're not making that many commits, but maybe they can help there as well. So it's really at the point, and imagine that at an institutional level. Imagine a vice president for research looking at something like that, right? And in essence seeing, look at these departments that are doing a tremendous amount of work in open source. Maybe they need a maintainer. Maybe they need a community manager. Look at this group over here that keeps saying their software is the greatest thing in the world, but let's look at the numbers. Maybe it is. Maybe they need different kind of help. As my provost directly said to me, I love all my children, right? When they all come to me with great ideas, of course they're wonderful. But the more tools I can have to look at this systematically, the more helpful, and more strategic he can be.
I was just going to say, and an organization like an OSPO can help that, right? Like can actually provide that oversight, but also be somewhere that can get actioned, to your point, because that kind of coordination across an organization or even across multiple organizations can be incredibly difficult, right? But someone has to do it to make it all sustainable. And you know, the stronger that muscle is to be able to deal with those issues as they come up, then the more sustainable the whole effort is. And you know, I know we've all got sustainability on our mind from various different things, but these things, and in particular when we think about even the things like the COVID response, you know, the urgency of the pandemic brought an awful lot of people in to collaborate on these sort of things. But how do we keep that as a sustainable network moving forward? Because, you know, if it's a flash in the pan and then they all go back to what they were doing afterwards, that's not going to help anyone. And next time around, maybe they're not available. And we've lost all that knowledge, not to mind all the potential additional collaborative output that could happen. But someone needs to be responsible for that. It doesn't happen by itself.
I'd love to jump in here, and because I'm fascinated by this, because it's very much something that came up in conversation at COP26 a couple of weeks ago. I was leading a discussion or a panel discussion on open collaboration, opening sustainability. So looking at how open approaches, open behaviours, open culture can aid us as we address collectively, globally, address the climate crisis. And that was very much part of the discussion, was that we need ways of facilitating collaboration. We need, you know, some kind of structure, some kind of thinking around that. Any thoughts on how what we can learn from OSPOs can be applied at that sort of large global context?
Yeah, I happened to be in Paris when COP26 was going on, so I was watching. One of the things I do when I leave the US is watch as many news sources and read as many news sources as I can, because there's actually news coverage outside the US. So one of the interesting things about the COP26 coverage was a lot of community leaders and organizations being interviewed and being written up. And several of them said, in essence, why are you talking to the same people who 10 years ago made all these promises and didn't follow through? And there are all these communities doing amazing things. You know, perennial agriculture is one example, right? These amazing things that are not getting the kind of, you know, amplification spotlight that they deserve, and not the amplification that's necessary in order to scale them to larger, you know, sort of areas and solutions. And I think this is, open source is just perfect for something like this, right? Because it's our own experience. I keep talking about this one community center in West Baltimore, but we're looking at them as an exemplar, right? If we can make this work as part of their digital strategy and their effort to support, you know, their community with workforce development, you know, sort of new technology systems, that's something other community centers in Baltimore can look at, right? And then if you have multiple community centers in a city, it's a very different approach to the city than if even Johns Hopkins goes and says, this is something you should look at. If 10 community centers in Baltimore say, we're using this common platform to solve problems like finding beds for homeless people, right? The city will pay attention. At that point, the city goes, something's happened here, right? And maybe we can provide a data feed, right, to support this kind of thing. We can't build a system, we can't procure the system. But look, they went off and did it on their own, and it's been scaled, and we can support that. There's also just the values, right? So there's a couple of groups at Hopkins. One is called Green Hacks, and one is called the Ecological Design Collective, that are looking at issues around climate change and openness, right? And what I found interesting is that some of it's values-based, right? It's closed systems have failed, you know, in some sense, right? It's just that, again, this is what got us to where we are today. So we have to flip that to open. And again, it's not a religious war, it's just pragmatic. It's one way is not working. So let's not keep banging our head against the wall trying to make it work, but change it to an alternate approach and see if that works. And this has all sorts of interesting implications. Like, so the United States had that, you know, oil refineries that were hacked, right? And, you know, energy security, which is a critical piece of this. Apparently 85% of oil refineries in the US write their own code. That is not a good approach. Okay, I don't think you have to be an expert to question that kind of approach. So what about a more systematic approach that's more open, right? So even large scale refineries can benefit from this type of this way of doing things. And it's a way for universities and municipalities to engage with these community efforts. And we do bring significant capacity to help amplify, but not necessarily show up and say, we're leading this and you're following, but rather this organically is showing some promise. Let's see if we can amplify it.
That's a very good point. The marketing, basically, we need to do marketing about the communities that are working in the open, and that's totally a need. So while you were talking, Sayeed, it came to my mind that there are two ways that we can look at creating sustainable communities. So if we focus, for instance, in open source, one of the I would say successes probably of those open source communities is because they have a clear mission that people can follow, and they have clear rules that people can follow. So if you agree about those rules and mission, then basically you can participate in the community openly. So you can join the community at any point and either consume or produce software or knowledge or anything. And then from an external perspective, if you read about the main open source foundations and so on, they always or almost always use the word adoption. So they are looking for technology adopters. So from an internal perspective, we have mission, a clear rules, processes. From an external perspective, then we need adopters. And for this, we need to deal with marketing and have much more marketing. So I do agree with you.
I would add as well, I think again, the open source community in particular, like their ways of working there's just so much that the rest of the world can, like the other types of collaborations can learn from that. The point that you made, Daniel, about having a clear mission written down and not just, like in detail with people commenting over time to go, and I meant this and I meant that, and this is an example and all that. So it's an evolving and yet persistent description of the mission, rather than it being 3 sentences that you came up with in a workshop that's been put on a board somewhere and everyone walks past and forgets about. Oftentimes they're much more active than other types of missions. And then the rules of engagement are similarly constantly being evolved, but also real emphasis on constantly improving them, because it's kind of like, things like how you contribute and how you onboard. Like there's a constant revision of can we make this better? Can we improve this ability to help people collaborate better, quicker, in a more frictionless manner? And so that's constantly being evolved, not just the code, but these ways of making it easier constantly. Like it's like a self-learning system in that respect, and writing it all down so that you don't have to be in the meeting and you're tracking it as you go. It's in a persistent place. You can collaborate even if you didn't make the Zoom call, and if you didn't happen to be in the right time zone, or if your language isn't English, and you can just take the time to go off and translate it in a translation engine and come back and do it yourself. Like there are so many ways of working in the open source community that the rest of the world need to understand the value of that for diversity and inclusion and ease of collaboration. And they're just principles that the open source community have learned a long time ago because it was necessary for the way they worked. But the rest of us have to get it there now for the other types of collaboration, because there's just too many good practices that we can't let slip. And we do, because we're rushing to get to the end result. Do we really need to take the time to document in detail how you onboard into this collaboration? Do we really have to do that? Like that's what happens in the real world, because you can just have one of those calls with Jen or Grania, like just talk to that person. But that doesn't scale. So the efforts that the open source community do are time consuming, but not only like very, very, very valuable. And I think the rest of the world could learn a lot from them.
Yeah, and I'll add the word trust to all the other adjectives that Daniel and Claire just mentioned. So one thing about this Ecological Design Collective, they explicitly state on their website, we are using open source and open infrastructure because we want people to know what we're doing with the data, right? We want it to be totally clear and transparent. And this is true of the Municipal Services Platform in Paris and the Community Center. Imagine two identical data use agreements being shared with the community, one from a community center, one from a university. which one are they going to trust more, right? So there's a very important connection between openness and trust. And if you're trying to work with community centers who may quite frankly have contentious relationships with institutions or organizations that typically try to help them, it's critical to be open and to say, you know, here are what we're doing with your data. If you don't like it, you don't have to participate, but we're not going to hide it behind this or have you sign a legal agreement as the means of recourse, but much more of a community approach of these are the accepted codes of conduct, right? These are the accepted values and principles under which we're operating. And I think a lot of people respond to that more favorably than an explicit legal agreement.
Yeah, indeed. So just wanted to mention here that I'm probably going back to the very first part of the discussion we had today. So this concept of making explicit the knowledge that we have has been really useful, at least based on my personal experience when dealing with large corporations and trying developers to collaborate with others, because perhaps another barrier beyond risk and budget is about not understanding each other. Maybe because you don't know the requirements, you don't have a full understanding of everything. So then what we are kind of asking for is to, okay, so all of that knowledge that you have in your minds, try to make this explicit so others can learn from you. So then we can scale, which is what Claire and Sayeed mentioned. So.
Absolutely. Well, as we're winding down and coming to a close, I do want to say thank you to all of you for your time and the expertise that you shared with us today. And I just wanted to follow up on what Sayeed said about trust. That is something that Grania and I have talk about all the time. I think we live in a time now where trust is citizens at large, like that's at the top of the list right now. Is how can we you know, look to others, and how can open source and just open in general teach us more about transparency and teach us about how we can build collective trust with each other and organizations and government agencies and so on. And it's such a crucial component to all of this, I totally believe. And so if you have we really just have like a minute left, but if you have any, you know, last parting words, I would just want to give you a chance to do that and just let everybody know as we close out. The replay will be up later today and we'll be able to share that around as well for anyone who's missed it. But I'll just kind of leave it in Daniel, Sayeed, and Claire's hands for a moment before we wrap.
Probably the only thing, or the call to action, I would say is join some communities, learn from the people, create you know, networks, trust, and the InnerSource Commons, the Chaos community, or some other open source projects are really great places for this.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. This is a very evolving space. We're all learning how to do this. No one really is like an expert on everything, because we're exploring new areas. But that's all necessary. So do it together. We'll all learn together.
Yeah, I'll just come back to that theme of we don't want to look for heroes. We want to look to ourselves, right? So one of the most wonderful phrases that I love is from the Hopi tribe. We are the ones we're waiting for, right?
Don't make me like you anymore, Sayeed, really. Just had to throw that one in there too. I love it.
One of my favorites.
It's a favorite. It's great. Well, thank you again to everybody. We'll let everyone get back into their day and appreciate y'all being here, and we'll see you next time.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.